Imagine sitting on the tarmac for 3 hours because a thunderstorm rolled through Chicago, or feeling the plane bank hard and climb steeply seconds after takeoff, engines suddenly cutting back for no reason the pilot ever explains over the intercom. Or looking out the window on final approach and realizing there's a sheer cliff waiting at the end of the runway instead of more runway. Most American airports are completely forgettable. A few have earned a very different kind of reputation among the people who fly through them regularly. Today, we're looking at the airports across the United States that passengers dread the most, and the very different reasons each one earned that reputation. The very last airport on this list changed U.S. aviation policy permanently after one single night in January 2025. Dread means different things depending on the airport. Sometimes it's genuine geography, mountains, cliffs, or elevation that leaves almost no margin for error. Sometimes the weather is so unpredictable it can shut an airport down without warning. Sometimes it has nothing to do with danger at all, just short runways, tight approaches, or a layout that stresses out even frequent flyers. We'll be clear the whole way through about which of these are actually risky and which ones just look intimidating from a window seat. The problem with this airport isn't landing at it. It's getting anywhere near your gate on time once you do. O'Hare is one of the busiest airports on Earth, and its location in the Midwest means it sits directly in the path of nearly every major weather system crossing the country, thunderstorms in summer, ice and snow in winter. Because O'Hare handles such enormous traffic volume, a single afternoon storm here doesn't just delay flights leaving Chicago. It ripples out and delays flights across the entire national air traffic system, since so many connections nationwide route through this one hub. Airlines have started building extra buffer time into their O'Hare schedules specifically to absorb these ripple delays, and even that often isn't enough during a genuinely bad summer storm cell. Passengers here have learned to treat a scheduled layover as a suggestion rather than a guarantee. Nobody's ever been hurt by an O'Hare delay. Plenty of people have missed a wedding, a connection, or a full day of their trip because of one. And O'Hare regularly tops the list of airports with the most weather-related cancellations in the entire country. If O'Hare's problem is weather, LaGuardia's problem is simply not having enough room. Squeezed onto a small patch of land in Queens, bordered on multiple sides by water, LaGuardia has historically operated with runways shorter than most major U.S. airports and airspace that pilots and aviation writers have long described as uniquely crowded. For years, it carried a reputation as one of the country's most outdated, most stressful major airports to fly through, memorably called out publicly by then Vice President Joe Biden in 2014, who compared it unfavorably to airports in developing countries. LaGuardia has since gone through a genuine multi-billion-dollar rebuild, new terminals, better connections, a real modernization. What hasn't changed is the fundamental geography. It's still boxed into one of the tightest footprints of any major U.S. airport, with almost no room to expand, meaning even small increases in air traffic translate quickly into the same tight spacing and short runway pressure that gave it its reputation in the first place. Midway has the opposite problem from its sister airport across the city. Where O'Hare is enormous, Midway is famously cramped, described as the busiest single runway class airport in the world for years, with runways close to 2,000 feet shorter than what modern airports typically build, all wedged into a dense residential Chicago neighborhood with almost no buffer zone. That combination turned tragic on December 8, 2005, when a Southwest Airlines flight landed during a snowstorm, overran the short runway, crashed through an airport fence, and struck a car on the street outside, killing a 6-year-old boy inside the vehicle. The crash led directly to new federal runway safety regulations, requiring extra buffer zones at short runway airports nationwide, changes that reshaped construction standards well beyond Midway itself. The airport has since made real safety upgrades, but the underlying geometry, a short runway with a city pressed right up against its edges, remains the defining fact about flying into Midway. Nicknamed the airport in the sky, Catalina sits at over 1,600 feet elevation on a mountaintop carved out specifically for this runway, on an island off the Southern California coast. Building it in the 1940s meant literally leveling off a mountain peak, hauling in fill dirt by the ton to create a flat enough surface for a runway at all. The location creates strong downdrafts and turbulence on approach, and the runway drops off steeply enough on both ends that pilots sitting at one end genuinely cannot see aircraft positioned at the other. Heavy rains have historically left the surface pockmarked with potholes and soft spots, and pilots landing here talk about a distinct sinking sensation on final approach as the plane drops into the thermal pocket created by the surrounding cliffs. It's a small general aviation airport rather than a major commercial hub, but for the pilots and passengers who do fly in, it's consistently named among the more unnerving small airports in the entire country. This next one isn't about geography at all. It's about a noise complaint that reshaped how pilots physically fly the plane. Because John Wayne Airport sits surrounded by dense residential neighborhoods in Orange County, strict noise abatement rules require pilots to take off at full engine power and then abruptly, dramatically cut back thrust almost immediately after leaving the ground, specifically to reduce noise for the homes below. For passengers unfamiliar with the procedure, the sudden power reduction seconds after takeoff can feel alarming, like something has gone wrong with the engines, when in reality, it's a completely deliberate, routine maneuver performed on nearly every departure. Flight attendants at this airport have grown used to reassuring first-time flyers mid-climb that the abrupt quiet is normal, and pilots are specifically trained on the procedure before they're ever allowed to fly the route, since getting the timing wrong risks violating the airport's strict community noise agreements. Now for something genuinely wilder. Sitka's airport sits almost entirely surrounded by the waters of Sitka Sound in Alaska, connected to the rest of the island by a narrow causeway. During storms, rocks and debris regularly wash directly onto the airport's only runway, something pilots have to actively watch for on approach. Large flocks of birds nesting near the water add another hazard pilots have learned to expect here as routine, not exceptional, and ground crews routinely have to sweep the runway clear before operations can resume after a rough tide. Combine that with Alaska's famously unpredictable weather, fog rolling in off the water with almost no warning, sudden wind shifts funneled by the surrounding terrain, and you get an airport where the runway itself sometimes needs to be physically cleared before a landing can even be attempted, a genuinely unusual pre-flight step most passengers elsewhere never have to think about. This is where things get genuinely dramatic. Joerger Airport's single runway sits on top of a flattened mountain, built between two sheer cliffs with drop-offs of roughly 300 feet on either side. If a landing or takeoff goes wrong here, there's nowhere to go but down. On January 19, 2010, a private jet rejected its takeoff and overran the runway, only stopping short of the cliff edge because of an engineered arrestor bed, a crushable concrete surface built specifically to catch exactly this kind of overrun. Nobody was hurt, but the aircraft was badly damaged. In 2017, a cargo plane crashed into a hillside while approaching the airport, killing both pilots aboard. Airport officials have pushed back on the airport's scary reputation, pointing out its runway length is comparable to major airports in New York and Chicago, and that serious incidents here remain genuinely rare given how many flights operate safely in and out every single year. The geography around it, cliffs on both ends instead of open ground, is what makes Joerger feel like an entirely different category of airport once you're actually looking out the window, regardless of how the statistics actually shake out. Telluride holds a distinction no other commercial airport in the country can claim. It's the highest elevation commercial airport in the United States, sitting on a plateau above the San Miguel River at over 9,000 feet. The runway itself dips noticeably in the middle, meaning passengers feel a genuine drop in elevation even after the wheels have already touched down. And here's the detail that raises the stakes for every single landing. Touch-and-go maneuvers are completely prohibited at Telluride. A pilot gets exactly one attempt to land. There's no circling back to try again if the approach doesn't line up correctly the first time. At this altitude, thinner air also means aircraft need significantly more runway distance to safely take off and land than they would at sea level, one more variable stacked on top of an already unforgiving mountain approach, which is part of why only specifically trained pilots are cleared to fly commercial routes in and out of this particular airport. Aspen's airport sits wedged directly between two mountains in a narrow valley, and pilots require special certification specifically to fly there, on top of their normal commercial licensing, because of the combination of high elevation, surrounding terrain, and frequently harsh winter weather. The airport's reputation isn't just about difficulty in the abstract. In March 2001, a chartered Gulfstream jet crashed on approach in poor visibility, killing all 18 people on board. It remains one of the deadliest general aviation accidents in recent Colorado history, and it's the incident most aviation writers point to whenever Aspen comes up on lists like this one. In the years since, the airport has tightened its approach procedures and pilot certification requirements even further, and officials have periodically debated whether the airport's tight valley location can even support the growing size of private jets now trying to use it, a tension that's only intensified as Aspen's popularity with wealthy travelers has grown. Snow, ice, altitude, and terrain all stacked together here in a way few other American airports have to contend with simultaneously. You're circling the Potomac River on final approach. The same stretch of river helicopters routinely cross just a few hundred feet below the standard flight paths jets use to land. This is Reagan National, and its single busiest runway, used for roughly 90% of all flights here, has long been described by pilots as one of the most challenging approaches in the entire country, not because of mountains or altitude, but because of what shares the airspace around it. On the night of January 29, 2025, an American Eagle regional jet on approach to runway 33 collided in midair with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter flying a designated corridor called Route 4, a route that ran directly through the jet's approach path. All 67 people aboard both aircraft were killed, making it the deadliest U.S. aviation disaster in more than 2 decades. The investigation that followed found the helicopter had been flying roughly 200 feet higher than it should have been, that air traffic control staffing that night was, in the NTSB's own words, not normal for the volume of traffic, and that a nearly identical near collision had actually happened on that exact same stretch of airspace back in May 2013, more than a decade earlier, involving the same helicopter route and the same runway approach, without triggering the changes that might have prevented this one. In that 2013 incident, a controller trying to keep the two aircraft apart had accidentally turned the helicopter in the wrong direction. Both aircraft managed to land safely that night. There was no second warning after that near miss loud enough to change anything before January 2025. In the aftermath, the FAA permanently restricted helicopter traffic near the airport and closed the specific route involved entirely, and regulators prohibited the simultaneous use of certain runway combinations whenever helicopters are conducting urgent missions nearby. Reagan National had been rated by pilots as one of the nation's most demanding airports for years before that night, thanks to its tight airspace, its short runways hemmed in by restricted government airspace on nearly every side, and the sheer density of both commercial and military air traffic converging over one relatively small stretch of the Potomac. It's now also the airport that fundamentally rewrote how the FAA thinks about mixing helicopter and commercial. Jet traffic anywhere in the country, a single night that aviation safety experts have since called one of the defining moments in modern American aviation history. A handful of others narrowly missed the list. Juneau International Airport in Alaska, boxed in by mountains and glaciers with weather that can shift entirely within minutes. Denver International, so enormous and so far outside the city itself that some passengers spend nearly as long getting to their gate as they do in the air. Palm Springs International, where desert crosswinds regularly buffet aircraft on final approach through the surrounding canyon terrain. And Washington Dulles, less dangerous than simply exhausting, still relying on mobile lounges to shuttle passengers between the main terminal and remote gates, decades after most airports moved away from the concept entirely. Some of that just makes for an uncomfortable flight. Some of it, as Reagan National showed the entire country in January 2025, can turn into something far more serious when the margins get thin enough. Weather, elevation, short runways, crowded skies, the list of reasons changes from airport to airport. The lesson each one leaves behind usually doesn't.